Clabberton. Welcome to Conversing.
It's a great personal joy to me to welcome Dr. Tom Boyce as our guest on Conversing. Tom is a pediatrician and distinguished professor emeritus in the departments of pediatrics and psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco. In 2020, he received the Child Mind Institute Sarah Gund Distinguished Scientist Award, and he's the author of a remarkable book, which will be the focus of our discussion, that's entitled The Orchid and the Dandelion: Why Some Children Struggle and How All Can Thrive. Tom, thank you so much for making time for this conversation today. It's a great gift to have you.
Well, Mark, I'm delighted to be in conversation with you.
Tom, this conversation is, I think, going to be a very rich one. And I want to set it up in this way, that I think the large conversation that we're having today is going to involve discussing your book, but I think it's held by a larger set of questions, which are captured for me in a story that you told in a public lecture you once gave, that expresses the challenges of seeing. And in a way, the challenge of being human, the challenge of being a parent, the challenge of being a physician is the challenge of truly seeing the people that are around us. I wonder if you could read the section of this lecture that you gave in Berkeley, which underscores the significance of our truly seeing those that we're near.
The late French philosopher and sociologist Michel Foucault argued in his book, The Birth of the Clinic, that the gaze or vision of Western medicine was fundamentally transformed in the 18th century by the advent of the autopsy. For the first time in the history of medicine, physicians were invited to peer into the darkened recesses of the human body and find there the locus, the very substance of disease. Foucault observed that this revolutionary change, the capacity for gazing upon and touching the lesions that are the sources of infirmity and death, altered forever our ways of seeing patients and their afflictions. From that time forward, human illness became embodied within the pathological material of the disease process. And the search for lesions, be they tumors or pathogens or disordered genomes, became the principal and essential business of medical care. The products of this changed vision, this new way of seeing and interpreting the signposts of disease, are abundant and all about us. Fiber optic endoscopes place our eyes at the very threshold of a duodenal ulcer. Magnetic resonance images allow both physician and patient to visualize a malignancy deep within the midbrain. Electron microscopy brings into view the pathological changes measured in microns in the kidney tubules of a nephrotic child. For those of us who frequent and inhabit the cathedrals of modern medicine, there is, I think, a kind of dazzling euphoria to be found in our seemingly endless capacity for seeing deeper, better, and more penetratingly into the heart of disease. And yet, for many of us, there is a suspicion, a gnawing discomfort about the splendid technological extensions of the medical gaze that changed so dramatically 3 centuries ago. For me, there is a growing unease that in our headlong efforts to bring into focus finer and more discriminating views of the lesions lying beneath disease, we will have missed the opportunity to envision the person or the patient that lies beyond the disease. In my life as a pediatrician, this discomfort has become what I would characterize as the ethical or philosophical equivalent of a prolonged headache, a constant backdrop of low-grade pain a touch of vaguely nauseating concern over how serious its etiology might be, and an awareness of something not quite right in my base of operations. A little more than a year ago, during my month serving as the attending physician on the pediatrics ward at the University of California, San Francisco, I ran across a dying boy who, together with his mother, reminded me, as I am often reminded, of the troubled, myopic vision so characteristic of the medicine I have learned and practice. He was a relatively young boy. I will call him Blake. No more than 7 years of age and afflicted with a terminal disfiguring version of mucolipidosis. For those unfamiliar with this disorder, it is a genetically based storage disease involving a pathological accumulation of complex carbohydrates in many tissues of the body, including the bones and joints, the heart, eyes, liver, spleen, and brain. It is a disease that is slowly progressive, usually ending in death from heart or lung failure within the first decade of life. Over the years of Blake's short life, the unabated metabolic hoarding of carbohydrates had severely deformed and retarded him. His eyes were clouded and protruded from his face, as did his tongue, like an overstuffed contents of a pastry shell too small to contain it. The gums surrounding his peg-like teeth were similarly engorged and frequently bled when disturbed. His massively swollen heart was failing, and he perennially threatened to drown in the secretions that flooded his airway. His chest and belly, glutted with a liver and spleen many times their normal sizes, had together become a single, reddened, congested globe from which 4 largely useless limbs projected. He was, in short, a small, grotesque tomato of a boy, whose appearance turned away even the most forgiving eyes. Blake also was not overly grateful for the abundant cutting-edge medical care being provided for him. I think he somehow sensed that he was near the end of his time, and he had decided that the sticks and pokes and serial examinations did almost nothing to allay the other torments that his disease had long prolonged. So the approach of doctors, nurses, technicians, and all the other assorted hospital personnel was greeted abruptly with a raspy, incoherent grunt and a flailing motion of his arm that meant indisputably, "Get out of my face." Blake's intolerance for the hospital and its staff, together with his unsavory countenance, made him a difficult patient for whom to care. His medical care was difficult by virtue of his resistance to our routines and procedures. But my own ability to humanly care for Blake also was compromised by the physical side of him and by his stolid indifference or antagonism to my best efforts on his behalf. One July evening, held in the hospital late by a series of unanticipated events, I approached Blake's room at an unaccustomed hour. His young single mom, who was at her own place of work for the daylight hours of most days, was sitting on the edge of the bed, deeply immersed in a conversation with Blake. I paused and then settled at the door, transfixed by the scene before me in the darkened hospital room. Blake's mom was talking to him. In hushed and comforting tones, she spoke of the day, wondering how things had gone, asking him about his new nurse, reviewing for him the events of her own day at work. As she spoke, leaning over her son, her hand stroked his forehead and hair in a mundane gesture that filled the room with her love for the boy. Blake's eyes, moist and utterly devoid of his stern resistance, looked up into his mother's face, absorbing every moment every piece of her presence there with him. Relaxed and more peaceful than I had ever seen him, Blake seemed to melt into his mother's eyes. She stroked his round, swollen face and said to him, "Oh, my beautiful little boy." Suddenly, I understood what I had not understood. When this mother gazed at her bloated, dying son, she physically saw a person I had never seen. Transformed by her eyes' willingness to see the child beyond the disease, Blake had become a different being, an individual no longer diseased and distorted, but a frightened child, visibly changed by his mother's love. In the months since that night and since his death later in that same year, I have often thought of Blake and his mother. I have thought of how limited my vision of patients has been, of the peculiar and short-sighted lenses through which so much of our vaunted medicine is conducted. I have thought of how mysteriously my own way of seeing Blake was irreparably changed by the experience of watching his mom truly see him and respond to him for who he finally was. I have thought as well of Jesus and the clarity of his sight, his capacity for seeing through all the littered crustiness of a person's life into the heart of an individual soul. I have remembered Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well, and how terrifyingly he took in and captured the totality of that woman's failed life. And seeing the depth of her need and the desperation in her hidden thirst for the substance of life, he offered her living water, promising that whoever drinks of the water he provides will find an everlasting spring and a source of eternal life. Imagine the transformation that Samaritan woman must have experienced 2,000 years ago. How the clarity of Christ's gaze, burning like a refiner's fire, reduced all of the complexity, ambiguity, and uncertainty of her broken past into a single vision of her greatest need, and then answered that need thoroughly and unconditionally. I have been looked upon by the eyes of Jesus at a time of extraordinary despair, so extraordinary that even now it is difficult to look back on. I was gazed upon and touched by the presence of Christ in the most mundane of settings, at the most unexpected of times. Overwhelmed in those days with a crushing, killing vision of my own inadequacy for life, I found myself utterly surrounded for a moment no longer than Blake's conversation with his mom by the palpable, unmistakable, and overpowering presence of God's love. In that moment, now many years ago, it was clear to me that I was seen for who I was and am, and that I was changed forever by the Lord's willingness to look upon me and find in me a creature worthy of his love and care. The wonder of Jesus' way of seeing people, such as me and Blake and countless others, is that it is a transforming vision. It is an instrumental vision that reaches into the essential character of the person and alters that character at its core. It is miraculously a way of seeing that is accessible to all of us, and one that transforms not only the person seen, but also the person seeing.
Thank you so much, Tom, for reading that portion of this lecture. It's a remarkable story, and it's so beautifully and tenderly and profoundly expressed. And it's the framework that at least I bring then to this book that we're going to discuss today. Tell us how this research got started. And I'm eager for our listeners to just immediately catch the wind of what it was that happened for you as you were unfolding in your research to discover the research area that you've then been pursuing for these last 30 years.
Sure. Well, I began, Mark, with an interest in stress and adversity, adverse experiences in early childhood. And I think that probably came from, my early experiences as a pediatrician in training, that there seemed to be children who had just extraordinary numbers of illnesses and injuries and behavior problems. And then there seemed to be children that had very, very few of those. And as I looked at those families during my residency training, I realized that so many of the families with these kids who had this inordinate difficulty with health and illness were families that were under a lot of duress, that were either experiencing a great deal of poverty or marginality, experiences of racism, all kinds of stressful life events. So I began the research by essentially looking at the effects of reported stressors in the lives of a young family. And it actually started out with work on respiratory illnesses, whether that was related to the incidence of respiratory illnesses over time, one of the most common forms of morbidity in young children. And, sure enough, we found that kids who had experienced more in the way of these adverse childhood events, what are now called ACEs, they had far more in the way of respiratory illnesses, both in frequency and severity over time. So that was the basic starting position, was this association between stress and illness in young children. But what we found over and over again was that when you actually looked at the data points relating these two variables, that there was just a tremendous amount of variation. There were kids who had lots of stressful events who had very little in the way of illness. There were kids who had almost no stressful events who had lots of illness. So it was a very noisy association. And we found that time after time as we looked at these two variables within samples and populations of kids. And eventually, we came around to, I'm saying we because this is my group of co-investigators that I did this work with. We came around to thinking, well, what is all this noise about? Is it that we don't have good enough measures of the things that we're wanting to relate? Is it that we don't have big enough sample sizes, so we don't have enough precision in the measurement? And we started to ask the question, is all of this variability, is it noise, as we presumed it was, or might it, as an alternative, be the music? Might it be the actual music that we ought to be looking
Yes.
at?
Yes.
That there's a connection between adversity and illness in kids, but it's highly variable. So that's how we started, was we asked this question in these associations that we so consistently get, is the variability that we're seeing in that relationship, is it noise or music?
Wow. Well, one of the things that unfolds in the course of the research from my reading of the book, which has been very moving to me, is just this sense of this emerging picture that comes after years and years and years of research and endless efforts to try to refine and test and prove various possible directions for understanding and interpreting the data. So share with people who are listening what emerges gradually that is such a significant, there's a number of significant breakthroughs, but give a picture of that.
Well, I think the core breakthrough was that once we decided that this variability in these associations was actually perhaps the music, we started bringing kids into laboratory settings, very standardized, very scripted, very predictable laboratory settings where we sat them down in front of a previously unknown examiner, a young woman that they hadn't known before. and asked them to go through a series of relatively mild, stressful tasks. And these were things like being interviewed by that examiner, or watching an emotion-evoking video clip, or the examiner asking the child to recite back a series of 4 or 5 or 6 digits that she would pronounce to the child, having a fire alarm go off in the middle of the session. And while they were doing these mildly stressful tasks over a period of about 20 to 30 minutes, we were monitoring the 2 principal stress response systems in the human brain. And those are the cortisol system, centered in the hypothalamus of the brain, cortisol being the stress hormone that has profound effects on cardiovascular functions, on immunologic functions, and so on, really pervasive effects all through the body. And the fight or flight system, or the autonomic nervous system, the part of the stress response system in the brainstem, which is what causes tremulousness or sweaty palms or dilated pupils. And we had ways of monitoring both of these stress response systems over the course of these protocols. And what we found was that kids had extremely variable responses to the challenging tasks that we put before them. Some kids had dramatically exaggerated, hyperbolic kinds of biological responses to even these mild stressors, whereas other kids, really the majority of kids, had little or no response in both of these stress response systems. So we had now in the laboratory, we had measures of children's individual responses to very standardized stressors that we could then take out into the real world and see how those kids responded to the naturally occurring adversities that they were experiencing in their real lives, at home, in their neighborhoods, at school, and relate that then to illness and injury and behavior problems. So that's what we began doing. And what we found was that the 70-80% of kids who had relatively diminished responses biologically in the lab had, as we might expect, very little response in terms of accelerating illness when they were naturally occurring, these adversities, in their natural lives at home or at school. In contrast to that, the children, usually 20-25%, who had these really hyperbolic, hyperdynamic biological responses, under conditions of naturally occurring adversity, those kids had the highest rates of illness, the highest rates of behavioral and mental disorders of any of the kids in the sample. And that's what we expected to find. It was the hypothesis on which the grant that subserved this research was based. What we hadn't expected to find, and what was really the turning point and the crux of the beginning of this research, was that children who were equally reactive, hyperdynamic responses biologically to these laboratory stressors, when they were experiencing very little in the way of adversity and a lot in the way of family support and nurturance and care, they didn't just have average levels of illness and injury and behavior problems. They had the lowest rates of those of all the children in the sample. So we had this subset of children who had either the worst outcomes or the best outcomes, depending upon the actual character of the social context in which they were living and being reared. And it was that reversal that was so fascinating to us.
Wow. I know that you specify in the book at one stage that what often gets said about this kind of correlation, maybe causation, is that it is sometimes seen as simply whether you have resilience or whether you have vulnerability. But what, if I'm understanding it right, what the research actually demonstrated was that those are not the right words or descriptors, that it's really about the receptivity, the sensitivities really to experience that this roughly 20% of the population has. And that high level of sensitivity can go in either of these two directions. So instead of seeing it as some are strong and some are weak, it's more like some are hypersensitive and some are less sensitive. Is that a fair way of putting it?
That's exactly it. I think there's this cultural myth that we have within the society at large, but certainly within pediatrics, that children are either vulnerable or resilient. We use this resilience as if it's a characteristic of small human beings. And it turns out that is a false dualism. It's not that there's vulnerability and resilience. It is that there is within this subset of kids both vulnerability and resilience in the same individual children. It's sensitivity, it's the tenderness of the child to the ambient environment that seems to make the difference.
Which is where then the nature and nurture part of this book and the research that you've done converge, because you can't really explain it just on the level of biology. It has to also be contextualized in the nurture or the surrounding circumstances that a child is facing. And hence, I suppose one of the most controversial parts of the book for some people, especially pure materialists, would be that it sees these two things as coming together and being necessarily intertwined and interconnected, as opposed to somehow thinking you can have biological existence or you could have social existence, and these two things might happen, but there's no actual correlation between the two things. Is that a fair way of summarizing it?
And the corollary to the vulnerability resilience dichotomy is that there are some kids who are vulnerable and we have to be really careful with them and pack them with great care and attention. And there are other kids who are resilient and who, we don't have to worry about as much. And I suppose in some ways that conclusion isn't entirely out of alignment with what we found, but it's this sensitivity to the environment that seems to be the key quality that we are identifying.
So describe that sensitivity just a bit more. Anybody who's been a child, which all of us have, and anybody who has been a parent understands by intuition some of what you might mean by those words, but refine it a bit for us. What does sensitivity in this context actually refer to?
Yeah, well, in the context of the original research, the sensitivity was the biological sensitivity of the child to these minor stressors that we asked them to go through. That's how we identified the highly sensitive kids. But, as we went on, we found that clinically that we began to see commonalities in who these kids were behaviorally, who they were within their families, who they were personologically. So the answer to the question, who are these sensitive, what we've called orchid children, they are kids who are often, though not universally, shy. They are kids who often have sensory sensitivities. So they may be sensitive to loud noises. They may have certain tactile sensitivities. They may not like, their socks being wrinkled inside their shoes. Yes. All of these kinds of things that parents are familiar with who have kids of this kind. And they have this interesting characteristic of having either the worst health outcomes or the best health outcomes, depending upon the kind of care and support and adversity that they're experiencing.
Wow. So one way of reading the book can at times feel like, wow, so the success, as it were, or the failure of parenting is the primary thing that it points to based on the sensitivity of the care that you're providing for a particularly sensitive child. Yet, as the research goes on, and as you talk about, a whole variety of other factors, that doesn't feel quite as onerous as it does at certain moments when this is emerging in the narrative that you're laying out about how the research was discovering. So explain a little bit more about how that is. Why shouldn't every parent listening to this fall into despair over their parenting in light of this significance of environment?
Well, I think there's no question that parents play an extraordinarily formative role in the lives of all children, but particularly these orchid children that our research seems to point to. But there are lots of environments that kids are embedded and nested within. Lots of kids are in infant and young child daycare right from the beginning. So there are implications for the caregivers of children within daycare and early childhood settings. There are great implications for teachers of children as they get into school, particularly in the early years of kindergarten and first grade. We think now that those are crucially important sources of either adversity or support and encouragement for young children. So, yes, parents and parenting are extremely important, just no question about that. But I think that there are others who are important as well. And I think that there are things that we can teach parents and teach teachers about how to respond to these kids who show this exceptional sensitivity.
Mm-hmm. One of the things about this book that makes it so additionally significant to me is that as you are engaged in this research, it gradually becomes evident to you that what you're seeing through this research is contributing to your own understanding of your own family background and your relationship with your sister and your sister's life and the trajectory that she took in contrast to the trajectory that you took. And you describe her as an orchid and yourself as more of a dandelion, while you admit, of course, in the book that this is actually a spectrum, not so much an absolute categorization. But insofar as she was more orchid-like and you were more dandelion-like, just share with people that story, because I think it enhances both an understanding of who you are as a person, as a pediatrician, as a researcher, looking at the very things that in some ways are most profoundly personal as well.
Yes, well, the operative word there is gradually. You said I gradually became aware of this linkage between my own life and the research that I was doing. There's somebody or other who once said that every photograph is a self-portrait, in the sense that the photographer actively chooses what he or she chooses to take a photograph of, how that photograph is developed, and so on. For me, that insight that I was studying the very thing that would unwind an enigma in my own family of origin came very late, almost embarrassingly late, to be honest. But it has to do with my relationship with my sister Mary, who was 2.5 years younger than me. We both grew up on the beaches of Southern California. We were the best of friends. We were really, I think, unusually so, the kind of go-to playmate of the other, each unto the other. So we were, for the first 10 years of life or so, just extraordinarily close. You know, we were parented by the same parents. We went to the same school. We played the same games. Temperamentally, we were similar in temperament and personality. We were both kind of nerdy, intellectual young children, if that's possible. And then toward the end of the first decade of our life together, there was just a dramatic divergence in our paths. I went not necessarily by my own abilities or my own will, but I took off on a life that I think of as shamefully good. I had a life that involved a professional identity and training, a research career that I have loved and that has been part of the fabric of who I am as a human being. I've had a almost now 50-year marriage to the same woman, Jill, my beloved wife. I have 2 kids. I have 6 grandkids. Like I say, a shamefully good life. And by comparison to that, what happened to Mary after that first decade of life, as she and I both went into puberty, she developed a chronic biomedical disorder, juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. She began having mental health symptoms that became increasingly severe. She had a diagnosis of schizophrenia by the age of 20. When she was a really celebrated graduate student at Harvard, she sustained an unwanted, unplanned pregnancy, which produced a baby that was birth asphyxiated and brain damaged. Thankfully, now a lovely young woman, disabled to some degree, but still surviving and doing okay. So it was this divergence in our 2 life stories,
Right.
that began to be explainable in terms of these research findings that we've been talking about.
I'm Mark Labberton. You're listening to Conversing.
It's so amazing to me that, and understandable, that a person can be so close to experiencing the thing that you're then objectively trying to examine as a scientist. But in this case, the social reality of how this was unfolding in your family and in Mary's life in particular, in contrast to your own, becomes a case in point around the very paradigm that emerges from your research that you've dubbed the Orchid and the Dandelion child. And in both cases, there's such similarity, and at the same time, there's this fundamental difference in the degree of sensitivities that end up ultimately tragically undoing Mary's life. And in your case, have become channeled into a very fertile, productive, highly honored, both professional life, but also personal life and family life in so many different ways.
Yeah. It's, it's important to acknowledge and to realize that both Mary and I grew up in
the same home,
family, the same home, the same house, the same neighborhood, went to the same schools. We were so alike in so many ways, and our experiences were so alike. But there was a tragic amount of discord within our family growing up. And I think that while that was troubling to me, it was in some ways catastrophic to Mary.
Right.
And it was her sensitivity to those experiences that I think started this deviation in our two paths. Mary was a brilliant young woman. She was physically beautiful. She made good friends. She was a brilliant person, and she could have, under I think different circumstances, become an extraordinary person.
Right. You described this really so beautifully, Tom, and I want to set the stage for you to say a bit more about that, because I think this part of your book, which comes at the start of the 9th chapter, a chapter called The Arc of Life for Orchids and Dandelions, you give, as that chapter starts, a picture of what parental hope for their children looks like. And then you obviously go on to describe the challenge when things become so much more complicated than this hope. But I think the hope that you paint there is so vivid. Please take a moment to just read that for us, if you would.
Sure. All parents yearn for their children's achievement of what Mary Oliver called a wild and precious life, a life of attainable happiness, sturdy health, fulfilling relationships, and some measure of success and meaning. This is the hope that stirs each mother's, each father's heart as they gaze for the first time into the miraculous and enigmatic face of a tiny newly born child. It is the hope that sustains their attentiveness and love through long nights of scant sleep and a baby's cry, the agony of a fevered illness besetting a fragile toddler, the tedium of Saturday mornings installed on the sidelines of the year's 23rd baseball game, and through the dark, lonely worry of watching an adolescent find her stormy way. It is the hope that moves the parent of every child, orchid or dandelion, boy or girl, biological or adopted, to dream of love and safety for that child, to long for fulfillment and favor, prosperity and virtue. Rare is the parent who dreams otherwise or fails to dream at all. Almost universally, we crave goodness and light for our children's childhoods.
Tom, that's just such a beautiful expression of what we think of as the common baseline. Surely this is what most parents hold in some way or another, measured uniquely by that parent, but expressed wonderfully in that opening paragraph of this chapter. And it underscores, I'm sure, and you give evidence of this, the intentionality of your parents, that both your mother and your father probably held very much those kinds of dreams and hopes for these two children, and eventually you have a younger brother as well, Jim. But in the course of starting life and starting parenting with this kind of a hope, things go bad for particularly the dynamic between Mary and your mom. And you do say by the end of the book that there's no doubt that she was a loving mother, but there was a chemistry in certain ways between them that became a source of the crisis, as particularly as Mary experienced it. And your contrasting experience of that same person didn't prompt the same or emerge for you in the same way in your own narrative of your mom's actions and words and so forth. So I guess I'm just wondering if you can fill out that picture a little bit and explain what that was, with all the kindness that you give to your mother and to Mary herself about this. And yet you do tell a story that I think is important for listeners to hear.
Yeah, I think it's an emblematic example, Mark, of transgenerational handing down of adversity from one generation to another. And I think that a lot of what happened between my mom and Mary had to do with my mom's history, her own childhood, and maybe the history of her own parents as well. She was raised in a very, I would say, sort of hyper-intellectual family in relatively rural Oklahoma. She had mostly sisters and one brother. I think early on in her life as a child, there was a competition with her sisters that set up sort of a lifelong suspicion of other women, other girls. I think she also, with respect to my sister, had the expectation that all would be well, that anybody could surmount any kind of problem that they encounter. That was certainly the spirit and the culture of her own family growing up. So when she had this daughter who began having not only chronic biomedical issues, but chronic mental health issues as well, I think it was just really beyond her. It was the combination of here is this other woman, young woman, who is having all of these symptoms and all of these problems. And how am I to deal with that? I think it was profoundly sad and hard for my father, my dad as well. But I think it was particularly painful and fierce for my mom to encounter that.
Mm. Mm. can only imagine in that circumstance, especially with your mother's background, how this brings forward then that catalog of childhood experiences of her own, now having this child that's struggling in so many different ways and feeling desperate, perhaps fearful of, quote, losing by comparison to her siblings. I have no idea how any of this played for your mother, but it's easy to imagine so many different kinds of points of tension. Well, at the same time, you clearly credit that she was also absolutely dedicated to being a loving mother. And yet the chemistry, the subchemistry, you might say, within their relationship was not a life-giving one. Sounds like for either of them.
My mom was in many ways a wonderful mother. She cared meticulously for her children, particularly when they were young and compact and small.
And pre-verbal.
Yeah, that's right. When they started growing wills, that became a little bit more of a problem. And when they went into puberty, that became a profound problem.
Yeah. This point that you make about intergenerational struggle and pain is one of the places where I think the book steps into some very important but not easy water because of this nature-nurture debate that goes on and the questions of whether the transgenerational passing on of various trauma, injuries, or pains of different kinds can actually occur. I want to come to that as a theoretical matter in a moment, but just express how in your research you came to really understand that this transgenerational trauma or pain or challenge, whatever it might be, is both real and measurable and quite significant in your understanding of what it is that you're describing in your research.
Yeah, well, for me, I really came at it, at least initially, from a biological standpoint, realizing that in the development of these different profiles of sensitivity among children, that there were both hard genetic kinds of influences on those profiles, those phenotypes, if you will. We've found, for example, that there is a set of multifactorial genes that are clearly related to the emergence of this more orchid or the more dandelion profile of susceptibility. But there's also evidence that there are environmental factors that go into the emergence of these phenotypes as well. So, for example, children who during early life are experiencing lots of adversity in the family, those kids seem to be predisposed often to developing this orchid phenotype. So there's evidence for both. There's evidence for genetic influences that are important and clearly reliable, and there's evidence for environmental determinants as well. So the question was, well, which is it? Is it nature or is it nurture? And as we pursued this research, it turned out that more and more what we were finding was that it's really gene by environment interactions that are determining the kind of sensitivity that a child evolves into. And understanding those gene environment interactions, what really assisted in that was the emergence of this relatively new field, I would say, over the last 20 years or so, of epigenetics. Epi, of course, meaning on top of, the word meaning a system of influence that lies on top of the genome. So the epigenome is the system, the array of chemical marks that actually lie on top of the genome itself that turn on and turn off and regulate the expression of individual genes. So it looks as though the epigenome, this epigenetics, is really kind of the synapse, if you will, between environment and the genome that seems to be the most salient determinant of where a child will lie on this spectrum of sensitivity and insensitivity as they grow and develop.
Right. So just say a bit more about that, because it is a very important finding, but also to some a controversial finding, who want to more clearly isolate the pure material from the social dimension. So for the people who, if you were speaking to somebody who would say, no, I don't believe that epigenetics has actually been proven, what would you say for starters? Let's hear about that first and then turn it around.
I would say, on the contrary, it has been proven as a means of gene regulation in both very primitive animal models, from, fruit flies to mice to primates to human beings. And it's been proven as an important influence in everything from embryogenesis, the actual development of the embryo and the fetus, on through to what happens later in human development as people go through childhood, adolescence, and on into adulthood. We know, for example, that the differentiation of tissues into brain cells or skin cells or lung cells is determined by epigenetics. That's how it actually happens. Every cell in our body has the same array of genes, the same genome in every cell, and yet there are these florid differences in tissue characteristics and types.
Right.
And that has to do with the epigenetic regulation of which of those genes are expressed and which are suppressed.
Yes. That's an extremely helpful and clear restating of why it's justified to make the claims that you do in the book. But for people who, which I at least feel like I read periodically, people who are working in the genetic field who feel skeptical about epigenetics, what are they skeptical about in light of what you've just said? Why are they not convinced by what you just said?
Well, I think there are areas that are still relatively opaque with regard to epigenetics.
Yeah.
We know, for example, that in lower animals, in fruit flies and such, and worms, and that there actually is epigenetic transfer of information from one generation to the other. It's almost Lamarckian in its implications.
Explain what that means, Lamarckian.
Well, Lamarck was a predecessor of Darwin, who claimed that experiences in adult life can be handed down to the next generation. And he
biologically,
he liked to talk about the experience of giraffes stretching their necks to nibble on, the most delicate leaves on a tree, as being a progenitor to the elongation of the giraffe neck as generations went by. He was profoundly disowned and criticized in his own time for these views, especially as Darwin's theories began to emerge. But over time, it's become apparent that, at least in lower animals, that there can be epigenetic transfer of information from one generation to another, as if Lamarck might have been tapping into something that actually was true.
It's true.
But that said, we still don't know whether that can happen in human beings.
Yes.
The First Nations tribes of Canada have been very interested in epigenetics as a potential means of explaining why kids who today are involved in delinquency and drug addiction and so on may be linkable to the experiences of their parents and grandparents in these highly punitive, highly constrained boarding school settings that they experienced a generation or two back. And we're just not there yet. That may be true, but it remains obscure whether this can actually happen in the human species.
Right. When I think some listeners who take this in, and I would encourage any of you to pick up this book and read it. It's a fascinating read, but it's also, as I've said, just an exquisite read. Your use of language, Tom, is really quite remarkable. And the telling of your personal story alongside the medical research and insight is just really something very special. But I'm sure some people listening to this just do wonder, is there hope? And you say in several different ways in the book, you give people some pretty specific handles on things that can at least point toward hope or lead toward hope in how a person who might find themselves as a parent, either of a child or potentially of someone who's in their early adulthood or even older, encountering this book, hearing about the significance of what this research is pointing to. So then in this section that you're about to read, you're trying to cast that in your own framework, which in part is a theological and spiritual framework, which you own and explain in the book, but I think quite beautifully expressed in this one section toward the end of the book. If you could read that, that would be great.
Yeah. I've come to suspect that a belief in some sheltering higher power is far more prevalent in our frail earthly lives than the dictums of an educated, enlightened, or intellectually serious life might normally abide. Whether in the form of some great spirit, a diaphanous sacred web of human connection, a menagerie of deities, or a personal creator God, reliance at some level upon a grace and wisdom larger than and beyond our own is the unmentionable shelter to which many of us often turn and must turn when the very best parenting we can render to a child is insufficient. Even scientists, professors, and physicians, mired as we are in this era of lofty scientific naturalism, hunger for something our science seems never to satisfy. Our longing for a greater, filling presence and a goodness that lies beyond and above the material constraints of finite lives and rocky soil. Mystery is the great embarrassment to the modern mind, wrote Flannery O'Connor. For me, that sheltering, sometimes, alas, embarrassing, mystery took the form of an itinerant first-century Nazarene, that ineffable God-man of the gospel, the heart that broke for all the broken-hearted. That last phrase coming from Malcolm Guite's poetry.
Tom, that just so exquisitely captures the tension of a book that is filled with real hard science and measurement, filled with real human experience in glory and in struggle and pain and confusion, in our experience of its being a morass of things. This hypersensitivity of 20% of the population, probably intensified and more generally experienced by children around the world who have such dramatic trauma from war and violence that it touches many in the United States, but certainly exists in places all around the world today, even as we have this conversation on Holy Week. How profound it is to point to a hope that in its mystery is the thing upon which we cast ourselves, because in the end, being a parent, being a person, being a parent, being a good parent is just overwhelming and wondrous in its highest and lowest degrees. So
yes.
I love the way that you've captured that dependency. As you think about that and particularly the children that you've worked with, and you think about their parents, how have you picked up on the presence or absence of that kind of spiritual dependency when all else just seems so overwhelming?
Sometimes parents will just tell you about it.
Yes.
They will in words tell you that they experience great despair and sadness over the trajectory of a child's life. And sometimes, if trust is established and there's an honesty between us, they will talk about what it is that allows them to keep going. And as I say in that paragraph, sometimes it is the Christian gospel. Sometimes it is a kind of network of support from community and friends that they rely on and depend on in very great ways. Sometimes it is another form of religiosity and spirituality. But if you listen for it and if you give an opening for it, particularly as a clinician, listening to the concerns and the fears of a parent, that will be there.
Tom, as you describe the findings of all of this work, and you hold, as you have expressed, to an experience of Christian faith and the meaningfulness of God's own vulnerability, sensitivity, how do you see the alignment between your research and the gospel itself?
Well, Mark, I think there are many dimensions of alignment. Just to mention a few, there's the way in which the research lifts up and focuses on the importance of children. The way in which the gospel, Jesus himself, but also others within the gospel stories, are so aware of how absolutely critical the life of children and of childhood is to the overall goodness and beneficence of human life.
Right.
The Lord God, whose chosen dwelling is the heart of the lowly, we give thee thanks that thou didst reveal thyself in the holy child Jesus, thereby sanctifying all childhood in him. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And by the way, the other thing to say is that although we found this heterogeneity within childhood populations in sensitivity to the things that happen in the environment, I would also want to say that in the larger scope of human populations, that children are the orchid human beings within human populations. So we know, for example, that children have more of the terrible effects of war. We know that they benefit more from positive interventions that we conduct as in public health and so on. So the centrality of childhood, I think, would be one. The other that I would point to is the business of the great reversal, the idea that to everyone in the first century's profound dismay, Christ came as this humble servant, honoring the poor, fraternizing with lepers, wanting children to be around him, this sense of there being this great reversal in the focus of his ministries. And I think that carries through into this research as well. The extraordinary reversal of an orchid child having either the worst outcomes or the best outcomes, depending upon social context, is itself a kind of reversal. And I think it raises the question of whether there are any human frailties that lie beyond redemption, because the kind of erasing of the vulnerability-resilience dichotomy is a kind of erasing of frailty. It's both and. It's not either or.
Yes. It's often, I think, been said in as many words that there's nothing that brings us to our knees, to our sense of powerlessness, quite like parenting does. And whether you're parents of orchid children or not, plenty of dandelion children as well as orchid children are beyond our capacity to, it seems, to adequately care for. And yet there is a hopefulness about this enterprise of parenting, of family making, of family building, of nurturing, of loving, of sacrificing, of giving, of celebrating, of discovering, that are also part of that great pilgrimage. And it's all wrapped into one one long experience that once it starts, in a way, never comes to an end. So it's a beautiful thing to have the research that you've done. This book, I know, has been very well received by many who have found it a pivotal book for them. In fact, I can say just anecdotally, the number of people that I have encouraged to read it has been many, and the number of those people who have come back and said, that book's one of the most important books I've read in a very long time, has just been the source of joy because of our friendship, Tom, but also the source of joy because I think the book in the end is really an offering of hope and love and tenderness that attunes us to the uniqueness of every child. As you say in the title of one of your chapters, no two children grow up in the same family. And that difference, that distinctive, nuanced difference between children, between human beings, between parents, is such a remarkable, wonderful thing and daunting thing. And your book leads us into that adventure, I think, with greater understanding and greater hope. Thank you so much for being a guest today on Conversing.
Oh, it's been a delight, Mark. I'm so happy that we could have this conversation.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe to Conversing on your favorite podcast app to listen to new episodes as they are released. And please leave a review. Conversing is produced by Peter Laberton and distributed by Fuller Studio.